Um, so I'm Lina. I think many of you know me. Welcome, everyone. It's very nice to see everyone here. Thank you very much for coming out on a day like this. Thank you very much for visiting us here in Brussels as well. Welcome, everyone online as well. I think we have an online audience today as well. So, welcome, everyone. I just thought we should, collectively acknowledge what's going on in the world. Our thoughts are with everybody who's affected by this horrible war, by all the other wars that are still going on. So, I just wanted to say a few words about that we acknowledge that, and that, evenings like this, where we build solidarity, we build peace, we try to exchange knowledge, insights, views, across borders, let's say, across military arrangements, across, between people and communities. So I really think, we should acknowledge that academically, that's the kind of work that we're doing. So thank you very much for coming out tonight to do that work, all of us together, right? So today we're very honored to have with us Dr. Kamna Patel. She's visiting us from London, where she's an associate professor at UCL, right? Mm-hmm. And so Dr. Patel's research centers around the connections between race and development, and very much a focus on housing and land tenure, very much what I'm doing in my work as well. So I'm pleased to be able to introduce you today. She also works on reflexive practice and post-colonial scholarship, on the teaching and practice of development. And then finally, another strand of her research is the application of a race lens to understand and act for equity and justice. And so tonight, very much in line with what our StadsSalon series is about, the theme, Kamna will be talking to us tonight about research she's conducted in South Africa and India, on land and housing tenure, on property rights, and also on ideas of citizenship, which are coded in national legislation, but also in claims of rights to the city. A very important topic, of course. And so with us tonight, she'll explore the role of property in either awarding or renewing or denying citizenship claims, right? And so we'll get a view of the many connections that exist between property and citizenship, and also the different barriers that exist to what she calls inclusive citizenship, right? So after Dr. Patel's talk, I believe you will be talking for 45 minutes, maybe an hour? Yeah, that's absolutely fine. So then after that, we'll have time for questions. And again, I'd like to underline how important your questions are. I really feel, I wanted to say that in some of the previous StadsSalons that I've seen, the debates have been very rich, and that really is not only due to the amazing speakers that we've had, but also, the questions that have been asked from the audience. If you have a question that is not entirely formulated in your head yet, that happens to most of us, please feel at ease, asking these questions. They're very, very important. Also, I wanted to mention that the questions can also be asked online. So in the platform, there is a chat. I think you have to log in to the platform before you're able to actually ask the questions on the chat online. Maybe test that during the lecture already, but if there is any problem, please try to get in touch with us, maybe on the Facebook of Brussels Academy, right? So that's always possible. So without further ado, Kamna, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to be here today and for turning up. This is always a pleasant surprise, especially when students turn up on a Friday night to a talk. So I am amazed so far already. I particularly want to say thank you to Lena and to Snow and to David and the team at StadsSalonsUrbains and the Brussels Academy. So who owns the city? That's our starting point, right, for this year-long lecture series. Who owns the city? In thinking about cities for people and not for profit. In my presentation, my engagement with who owns the city and how is anchored in who is the city for and how is this policed, be it socially, culturally, legally, economically, or politically. And my frame of reference, as Lena mentioned, is this concept of inclusive citizenship and the role of property that is embedded in ideas of citizenship. So I'm going to be drawing on some empirical work in Durban, South Africa, and that's the image that you can see here. That's a picture of an upgrade of an informal settlement. So in the foreground here, that's the final house that is built, and in the background you can see the shacks that people are moving from into these houses at the front. So I'm going to be drawing on work from Durban and Ahmedabad in India with respect to how marginalized people make claims to property, be it land or housing. And I want to explore how claims to property are made through two discrete perspectives. One is the perspective of the state, and one is from marginalized people. And then look at what role property therefore plays in awarding, renewing, or denying individual claims to citizenship. Now, in my abstract, and you're all very studious, I'm sure you read it, I say I'm not going to be presenting a polemic, and I'm not. But what I'm hoping to do is to lay some of the groundwork for a much deeper conversation with you on what are the possibilities and the challenges of multi-scalar inclusive citizenship. So what is this thing that I'm talking about? What is inclusive citizenship? Let me first start with a very neat definition of property. It comes from Christian Lund. And he says, property is about relationships among social actors with regards to objects of value. Now, this can be housing, it can be land, or some other type of material object that can be claimed by people. In stressing that property is not about the thing, property is about social relationships. What Lund is stressing is that for property to exist as property, there needs to be a social agreement that that object is property. It's the socialness of property that is its strongest conceptual link to ideas of citizenship. Now, citizenship, in my use of the term, are the obligations, the rights, the responsibilities and behaviours that govern our relationships and set the parameters of our relationships with one another. And that can be at the scale of the individual, or ethnic groups, or religious communities, and our interactions with this thing that we call the state. So what this means is that citizenship is continually constructed through re-articulations of our relationships with different social actors. It is fluid. The framework for articulating citizenship includes legal terms and conditions of membership to a nation state, so your civil and political rights, or claims to membership to society based on moral or social rights. These constructions of citizenship are conceptually distinguished by James Holston as formal and substantive citizenship, respectively. And Naila Kabir adds that claiming substantive rights by marginalized groups is what can be labeled an inclusive citizenship. This is a citizenship from below. To folks like Sue Parnell, she's argued that the realization of inclusive citizenship demands an interventionist state. Her and Peters argue that the multi-scalar nature of the state's actions are necessary for the full realization of human rights. What their argument does is alert us to the importance of the multi-scalar state, so the state operates at multiple different levels, to any analysis of housing rights. Let me briefly clarify here that the state is not a fixed entity to me, but its machinations are real. So there are courts of law, there are politicians, there are laws and regulations like building codes, there are local authorities, there are police. All of them are manifestations of the state. But what blurs the boundaries of the state are people's interpretations, perceptions, and therefore their actions in relation to these little bits of the state. I wanted to tease out these different conceptualizations of citizenship, the formal and the substantive, because it's worth noting that dominance ideas of citizenship affect the purpose of housing delivery. So housing rights and the right to housing, two different conceptual frames, is a useful distinction to illustrate this. Housing rights refer to the legal right to hold property, and the conditions under which property is held. And this is then backed up by formal institutions, the courts and state bureaucracy. So how many of you have a rental contract in place? And if your landlord fails to live up to their obligations, you have a recourse to go to the courts to ensure that that contract is upheld. The right to housing, on the other hand, is a moral or social right, where, for example, informal settlement is understood as the actions of citizens that simultaneously realize their right to housing in some way and contest the state's monopoly on determining the legitimacy with which people stake claims to space and belonging. So that moral right is not contingent on the state. It's a moral obligation that is expressed with claiming land, in whichever way is open to people to claim land. So literature on substantive citizenship often emphasizes the way people make and sustain claims to space, often despite efforts to marginalize them. So the idea of calling such spaces informal, which is what Ananya Roy has argued, is a technique of government, a technique of the state to make people marginal. The creation of calling dwellers, people that live in such places, encroachers, to encroach on land rather than claiming land, is another technique of language that can be used by the state to marginalize people. From this view, inclusive citizenship and the creation, therefore, of inclusive cities develops a role for the state based on the idea of poor people's right to the city, which is, I'm sure, a phrase that you've come across many times. In a state-centric view of inclusive citizenship, the exact role of the state in delivering housing varies. The state as a house builder, which was the dominant discourse in the 1970s, has given way to the state as an enabler of housing markets. Now, in this role, there are three basic principles that advance inclusive agendas in housing delivery processes and their outcomes. The first is a holistic approach to housing that includes frameworks for sustainable environmental management and economic activities that reduce urban poverty. The second is partnership. The state undertakes partnership with civil society and private sector actors. And the third is the active involvement and participation of people. The structured participation of shack dwellers in particular is this driving discourse in good development practice that materializes in top-down housing delivery programs like the one in South Africa that I showed you the picture of. But buried within this state-centric view of how to be inclusive is also how the award of property rights is a technique through which people are governed by the state. So people are then fixed, they're located in a place. The provision of safe services like electricity and water no longer comes from agitation and lobbying, but, and I'll illustrate this later with an example from India, it comes from a corporate market sanctioned by state law. So you have to pay your bills, typically to a private provider, under threat of court action. It's the ways in which the market works hand in hand with the state as a form of governance of people. People's lives are subject to the environment that is engineered around them. So like in that picture that I showed you of the informal settlement, the upgrade site, access to public transport, the physical built environment, spaces to play and social interaction are all determined by the state. In thinking of property as a technique for state governance, inclusive citizenship is a continuous struggle. So securing housing is never the end of one's struggles to live and to thrive. So why does the state award property rights? I want to go into a little bit more detail about why not only do they award property rights, but why do they award them to marginalized people in urban areas? And I'm going to unpack property rights to focus on tenure rights specifically. And I want to propose three ideas. There's no single rationale for the motivations of the state. These three ideas or explanations typically work in combination and they overlap. The first is for what I'm calling political settlement. So legal property rights are awarded for a political settlement. A political settlement aims to uphold the rights and responsibilities between citizen and state. Most states in the world have ratified at least one international treaty or convention, and and has committed some kind of a declaration that affirms people's rights to adequate housing, which includes an entitlement to tenure security. So in South Africa, in the 1996, so this is the first post-apartheid government, the South African Constitution makes two provisions for inclusive citizenship through housing. The first is a legal right to housing provision and for the devolution of power to housing delivery to local government. These provisions suggest that housing is a positive right, and its delivery is part of a formal citizenship. Formal citizenship is membership to society on the grounds of nationality, which in South Africa is attained through birth, descent, or naturalization. It can make less important identities of ethnicity, of race, and language, which otherwise form the basis of membership to society. And this is quite important in a country like South Africa, whose history is marred by racist politics. So how can we have a national idea of belonging in a place and use property to invoke that national idea of being in a place that overcomes racialized segregation and distinctions that are part of being South African? This South African experience of racist and ethnically divisive law, policy, and practice is evident in the location, ownership, and use of land and housing. And that's what necessitated South Africa's legal right to housing. It's a way to redress past injustice and contribute to the creation of a common South African with a common set of rights. The constitutional right states everyone has the right to access adequate housing, and the state must make reasonable legislative and other measures to achieve the progressive realization of that right. That constitutional principle establishes the responsibilities citizens can expect from the state. There's also a strong sense of historic restitution. White landowners held land on the basis of freehold title with full property rights protected by the state. And why should anything less than what is considered by the likes of the World Bank as the gold standard of tenure security not be available to black South Africans? That's part of the rationale as to why particular type of property rights are awarded in these upgrading programs. At the point of the election of the ANC in 1996, and at the end of apartheid, 90% of all land was owned by whites, and 10% by Indians, coloureds, and blacks together. And I'm using the language of race discourse in South Africa there. In India, the constitutional obligations of the state are much more implicit, and they encompass a protection of life and personal liberty. Article 21 of the Constitution states, "No person shall be deprived of his life or personal liberty except according to procedure established by law." So the inclusion of a right to housing comes within a fundamental right to life, and it's been established by numerous Supreme Court rulings. So notwithstanding the state's upward accountability to international legislation, it establishes a legal framework that protects tenure security for particularly weaker members of society. States then, particularly in the case of India, draw citizens into legal tenure security as part of their progressive commitment to the inclusion of socially excluded citizens. In India, as intended by the chief architect of the Constitution, Bhimrao Ambedkar, drawing low-income citizens, especially those labelled scheduled caste and scheduled tribe, into the remit of the modern secular state governed by a rule of law is part of building an inclusive citizenship, where scheduled caste and other groups who are exposed more than any other citizen to exploitation and injustice have at least a right in law as a precursor to any social and political exercise of those rights. The second reason why the state might award property rights is for economic development. Now, this second explanation is that drawing low-income citizens into a legal tenure system is part of a strategy for economic development. In economically liberal and liberalizing states, as India has been after 1990, and South Africa has often been described post-apartheid, where the country desperately needed foreign currency and international markets for its stability, property rights and tenure security protected by law have at least two potential economic gains for citizens and the state within that legal framework, within that liberal framework. The first, citizens can more effectively raise finance using their property as collateral, which can then be reinvested to build individual or household assets, and the state can raise municipal finances through property tax and real estate development. The economic gains for citizens from a legal tenure security has been argued by Hernando de Soto, someone who I'm sure you're familiar with. Yes, very familiar with, perhaps. It's astonishing that The Mystery of Capital, his book in 2000, is still popular, and that people are still taking ideas from it and implementing ideas from it. They are very much in evidence in countries that pursue liberal agendas, specifically here, South Africa. De Soto maintains that only through the inclusion in legal property system, which offers the highest tenure security, can the poor access formal credit and release dead capital locked in their land and housing, and so overcome their poverty. He articulates a simple solution of self-help among the poor within an all-encompassing state apparatus that eliminates what he calls extra legality and unenforceable social contracts that otherwise govern property markets. In South Africa, state-led housing programs, specifically upgrading informal settlement, involves a package. You get a house, you get services, and you get a freehold title to any family that's eligible based on criteria established by a local authority. The rationale for freehold title is strongly rooted in De Soto's ideas, and it's propagated by international development agencies who put funding into freehold titling and land tenure regularization programs. And as a disclosure, I used to work on one in Rwanda. It was funded by the UK government, and it has millions of pounds in regularizing land and putting out freehold titles to people that live there. The second reason for potential economic gain for the state from property rights works in parallel with globally popular governance reform of decentralized government, which is where Indian and South African municipalities are increasingly charged with their own administrative and fiscal responsibilities. In other words, local government has to raise revenue to pay money for services in local areas. And where they used to get grants from central government, they now have to raise their own money. And one way that they can do that is through raising property tax. In Ahmedabad, the Municipal Corporation, the AMC, has targeted reforms of property tax in recent years to increase their revenue base. The AMC first updated their municipal property records and added new properties to their register. They reassessed the value of properties and implemented punitive measures for tax defaulters. And these efforts increased the tax base from 37% of assessed properties that paid tax to 55% in a space of 3 years. That's quite a huge increase in tax. In Ahmedabad, people living in informal settlements, even if they're connected to municipal services, do not pay property tax or service charges. People who own housing that is recorded in the municipal property register, so what we might call formal housing, are subject to property tax. The third reason why the state might want to give legal tenure is to manage informality, this thing we call informality. This explanation of the state's motivation to expand the provision of legal tenure security, it requires contextualizing the potential economic and political gains and losses to a shift to legal tenure security within a much larger discussion of governance and the role of the state. In Seeing Like a State, James Scott, who's an anthropologist, argues that states act to implement rational order over society, to facilitate what he calls high modernism. And the tools around rational order include codified rules, maps, and ledgers that make society legible to outsiders. The lens through which we might view the state is relevant to debates over tenure regimes and property rights, particularly where codified rules in legal tenure security and property rights are privileged over local systems, socially complex tenure arrangements that are often found in informal settlements. And in the case of South Africa, customary rules, rules based on tribal precedents, traditional ways of owning land ownership. The concept of informality, Ravi Kanbor has argued from an economic perspective denotes the absence of state regulation and the loss of a government's function. Whereas James Holston, who is another anthropologist, suggests living informally is part of an insurgent citizenship that can represent spaces of resistance to the power of the state. Now, from these two very different perspectives on the value of informality, there's a common idea. That informality represents a social order that competes with the authority and the legitimacy of the state, thus subsuming informal tenure arrangements into a tenure regime that can be regarded as consolidating state authority over all citizens and the incorporation of spaces of opposition within the purview of the state. Now, this might be for progressive reasons, but more often than not, and I say this as a British person, for nefarious purposes. The state can act in all sorts of ways, and it is not always for the good of people. However, the state, in Scott's analysis, is this fixed monolithic entity, one capable of central planning, and it moves with a single purpose. Whereas studies that foreground the everyday as a methodological technique allow for plural representations of the state and turn us from seeing like a state to actually seeing the state. And the focus from the perspective of citizens who encounter the state through its multiple representations in a variety of everyday experiences, such as finding a place to live, to work, to educate oneself and one's family, to stay healthy, gives us a different perspective of the state. For people living in informal settlements or at the margins of society, their encounters with the state are most likely through mundane representations of the state, like filling in a form, entering a local office, electing a councillor, meeting a municipal worker. Thomas Hanson calls this the banality of the technical side of governance, and that stands in stark contrast to what he calls the sublime. That's the perceived qualities and values of the state, such as its high authority and the figure as an arbitrator of fairness and a protector of everyone. So in your own imaginations of the state, if someone asked you, what is the state? Maybe you go, oh, the state is the High Court, or it's that building in the middle of Brussels somewhere. It's not. In the view of the people who are encountering or in the state, it's filling in a form. That is the state to them. So the scale of the state shifts when we foreground the perspective of citizens, which has implications for how we understand citizenship. Staying with the everyday and encounters between marginalised people in the state, I want to take a closer look at the award of property rights in two stages, drawing on empirical examples from South Africa and India. And here I'm not making a comparison between the two, but I'm trying to see if there's a bigger trend, if there's something else that shifts between the contexts, that allows us to say something about inclusive citizenship and property. The first is housing allocation, and I'm going to look at examples from Durban. And then it's living in a state-allocated house, with examples from Ahmedabad. And that's what a completed, upgraded settlement looks like. Rows upon rows of similar shapes. They look a little bit like sheds, but there's a kitchen in there, and there's a bathroom, and there's one bedroom. In South Africa, the process of upgrading informal settlements to units of housing with title and services is decentralized, and power is devolved to municipalities. And as part of initiatives for greater community participation, settlement-level actors are very involved in the upgrade process. So they would include members of a ward committee or a community development committee. They are comprised, for the most part, of elected residents whose power and responsibilities are determined by locally developed norms and rules. Ward committees are a formal administrative unit and include locally elected councillors. Now, in reality, what I found is that community participation is limited. For example, settlement-level actors are not involved in the design of a house. They're not involved in the evaluation of an upgrade program. Instead, they have three roles. They draw up lists of eligible residents. They monitor newcomers so that they don't take advantage of the upgrade scheme. And they facilitate the entry and exit of municipal officials and housing professionals like builders and surveyors and engineers and things like that. Those involved in these tasks are given great flexibility in exactly how to interpret their role in the process. creating opportunities for them to manipulate the process according to their personal and political preferences. The current process through which sites for upgrade are selected and these houses built leaves room for extra criteria developed by local elites, which have two dimensions: preference and process. Process primarily concerns how long a subsidy-eligible resident has lived in the settlement targeted for upgrade. So they monitor and they implement a cut-off date to disincentivize newcomers who might be looking to take advantage of an upgrade. Preference means the preference of local elites, which in my study has a strong ethnic and party political dimension. Preferences are inferred from the behavior of committee members and residents' interpretation of these. Committee members are believed to prefer members of the ANC over those of other political parties. isiZulu over isiXhosa speakers, and Durban is in KwaZulu-Natal, so it's a predominant Zulu area, and South Africans over foreigners. While the criteria are resolutely local in their application, there's a scalar element to them that illustrates that the local cannot be an isolated scale of analysis, and what materializes at the local reflects regional and national flows of power. So in the case of ANC membership, political and ethnic tensions that play out in preference of AmaZulu, and widespread public debate on the role of foreigners in South Africa. Among respondents, the first widely believed criterion in the politics of preference is membership to the ANC over any other political party. And this widespread belief in the power of ANC membership is with some merit. In my study site, wards were governed by an ANC councillor, and ward committees were dominated by members of the ANC, many of whom are active in their local ANC branch. Thus, awarding ANC branch members a stake in resource allocation through their official roles in committees serves to strengthen that association between being a member of the ANC and having access to housing. The second widely believed criterion, which is closely related to the politics of the ANC, is ethnicity. The discourse of ethnicity and tribe was at the forefront of national politics, leading up to the 2009 presidential elections, when Jacob Zuma's political campaign rested, or it seemed to rest, on invoking his ethnic identity and gender identity as a strong Zulu man, and the strong leadership characteristics attributed by his supporters to this. Zuma's image stands in stark contrast to the man he replaced, Thabo Mbeki, an isiXhosa speaker, whose projected identity is captured in his "I am an African" speech, where he spoke against ethnic divides in favor of a national South African identity. It's a stance echoed by Zuma's successor and current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, of Venda. Back in 2009, the contest for power between Zuma and Mbeki was clearly based on issues other than ethnicity and its role in the future of South Africa. The result of their high-level contest fractionalized the ANC in ways that is still visible today, particularly around the arrest and the detention of Jacob Zuma, with at least one important implication at the local level. It has been interpreted by some grassroots activist residents in my study sites as an ethnic rivalry. Commenting on national politics, a young Zulu male, a member of the ANC Youth League, stated to me that for me, Thabo Mbeki hates us. Not just him, but a certain percentage of his group totally hate Zulus. And not just from him, from the Zulu faction too. There are leaders whom we know who do not get along with anyone from the Eastern Cape. I wouldn't say that Jacob Zuma is a guy who has troubles against anyone or is a guy with a tribal background, but his election has, and I cannot say it has not, encouraged people who think like that our time has come. I think Zuma has influenced a lot of people here. I hear a lot of people say, Zuma, yes, that's it. That's what we're talking about. Closely related to ethnic and tribal tensions is where the politics of preference and process overlap. And that's the creation for eligibility for housing allocation of South Africans over foreigners, which is influenced by countrywide debate on the role of foreigners in South African society and concerns of xenophobia. Xenophobic acts reported in the country in 2008 initially were closely related to a sense of entitlement and a loss of entitlement amongst South Africans. Attacks on foreigners in urban areas have been called a struggle for space, jobs, and other resources. The person I quoted earlier, he said later, "I expect this xenophobic violence," in 2008, "to happen again. In Zulu, we have an idiom, where water once ran, it will come through and run again. So with these attacks, there's a danger they will come back and be even bigger than before, because these issues, they're still there. You know, the problem that South Africans have with foreigners is that they get paid less than we do, so we lose out on jobs. These issues are there." And I suppose anyone paying attention to right-wing politics in Europe would recognize that sentiment. Although xenophobia can be dated to earlier periods of South African history, it has been argued that since 2008, ethnic identity amongst the poor has become sharper, as their sense of civic identity and citizenship has been disappointed by the failure of the new state to deliver a better life for all. Now, I'd like to bring this into closer illustration with an example from the life of another respondent. In the politics of process and cut-off dates, being able to establish your narrative as an early settler is really important. Residents who built their own shack have the strongest compelling narrative. Later, as more people arrived, they have to ask their neighbours and those already settled in the area for permission to stay. It creates a dependence on oral histories that means good neighbourly relations matter. They're essential for residents to validate their tenure claims and thus be eligible for a house. But there are instances where narratives of origin are insufficient. One person described himself as an early settler. He and his girlfriend moved into the settlement in the early years, in the mid-1980s. They'd asked for permission for those around them and then built a shack. There was no dispute that this person is an early settler, but he is also a foreigner. And so he and his family were not there during a shack enumeration exercise because countrywide xenophobic violence at the time forced them to flee the settlement until tensions died down. On his return, he said that he would have liked the opportunity to make a case for a subsidy-built housing to the municipality. He said, "I deserve a house because although I'm a foreigner, I deserve to get something here. I've been living here a long time like a South African, and I even have children here." His expression to a right to housing is based on a conception of citizenship that expresses both legal entitlement to housing for his South African children and his moral right to membership to society based on deserving something after many years of contributing to that society. However, this was against popular sentiment. So in the competition for scarce resources, the actions of settlement leaders that contravene both the official process and local criteria carry popular appeal. To people at the margins, and in this case, at the margins of the margins, encounters with the state at the scale of the everyday cement the idea of an exclusive citizenship, or at least a compromised inclusive citizenship, that is dependent on a politics of preference that plays out most evidently across ethnic and national lines. I'd like to move us along a little bit in the housing process from allocation to actually living in one of these properties. And that image is from Ahmedabad. That's a state-built housing block. It's an apartment block, and these are called 1BHK. So it's a one-bedroom apartment. This particular block and others like it are built on the periphery of cities. So where South Africa is an upgrade, this is a relocation site. Through exploring what it means to live in state-allocated housing, we can clearly see how struggles for inclusive citizenship continue. The house is not the end of the story, and it continues particularly for the most marginalized and for what to them is the state. In the case of Ahmedabad, this was a resettlement scheme, so people moved from a city centre location to the periphery. People's encounters with the state here are mainly through a politics of fear and a politics of control. Within the context of Ahmedabad, which is a communal city, so by that I mean it's a city that is known for religious-based violence and tensions, particularly along Hindu-Muslim lines. Riots and the subsequent displacement of people have engendered religious and caste-based patterns of settlement in parts of the city, remoulding the city into divided and divisive spaces. In Ahmedabad, the municipality was a direct implementer of housing, allocating housing units directly to people who passed through an eligibility process. The houses on offer are subsidised, but they still cost money. People eligible for resettlement, they sign contracts with the AMC, consenting to the terms and conditions of their residence. They pay their first instalment and move in. Families of varying size occupy still the same one-bedroom apartment and begin the process of learning the rules of residence in their new settlement. Because although they're given written copies of the terms and conditions with which the duties and functions of residence are clearly laid out, the residents report not fully reading or understanding the document. One man explained that he and his family were living on a temporary plot of land for 3 years before being offered resettlement housing. He explained that when he was given the contract to sign, he says the AMC did things underhand. They covered the front page and they folded the others so we could only see where we had to sign. We didn't read anything before we signed the paper. Most of the other people there in the temporary site were living without clean water, the mosquitoes were really bad and the shelter wasn't strong. So, when the AMC came and said, "We're giving you a house if you sign here," we all signed. People like us, literate people, we didn't even get to read it at all. Now, the significance of the content of this document only becomes apparent much later, when the AMC starts to enforce or threatens to enforce some of those terms and conditions. The most contentious terms that bring residents and the AMC into a tense standoff are those related to occupancy, payment, because this is a subsidy that needs to be paid for, and property management. They're also the most ambiguously implemented rules, largely because residents experience tremendous difficulty in complying with them, and the AMC is insufficiently resourced to fully implement them. This parallel contention and ambiguity creates conditions where many residents are both fearful of the actions of the municipality and hopeful that there's room to carve a space to negotiate on which rules are partially enforced. The first choice faced by thousands of people in the settlement site was to make a first payment that signed a contract which includes a commitment to future payments or to walk away from the resettlement scheme entirely. One person said, "It's difficult to find the money to pay for this place, but we have to find it." People were saying if you don't find the money for the first installment, the property will go from you. Somehow you have to find the money to pay. For this first installment, we were all able to pay because we lived by the river in the city centre. We had a good job, we had some good opportunities, and so we had some savings. But for the next lot of money, how do we pay that? There are no jobs here, there is no way to earn an income, and now we have few savings. The person who said that, she and her family worked as cooks, catering for family functions for wealthy Ahmedabadi families. In this site, there are no families. There are no such families living nearby. Since moving from central urban locations, all respondents reported major increases to their costs of living, particularly transport to the city, as you might imagine, and high electricity bills. All of these units are fitted with an individual electric meter, powered by Torrent Power, which is a large private utility company, which prevents shared connections between households, which was a common strategy that people used previously to reduce their living costs. It's resulted in a sharp increase in costs. For one resident, from around 500 rupees a month to between 1,000 and 1,500 rupees a month. You don't need to know exactly how much is a rupee to a euro, but you can work out that it's doubling the cost, tripling the cost. All respondents were aware that if an electricity bill is not paid, the company, they don't just cut the electricity, they take the meter. They take the whole thing. And if you want it back, you have to pay. You have to pay for the meter to come back and the connection. And sometimes that ends up being double the whole bill. So faced with these competing demands on income and savings, such as making regular payments to the AMC for their property, or paying an aggressive electricity company, buying enough food to eat, people are compelled to rank and choose between their financial responsibilities. And the severe consequences of not having access to electricity or to food means that they're prioritised over paying the municipality for their housing. Additionally, there's a widespread belief that the AMC can be negotiated with in the wider context of vote bank politics, whereas electricity companies cannot. So across the settlement, illegal subletting and squatting was prevalent as a means to raise income, to allow people to either move back to the city centre and travel and work from there. It meant that property raids were frequent and carried out at random by local AMC officials, who were often accompanied by the police in groups of 6 to 10 people. When experiencing a raid or witnessing one, residents say they cannot tell the difference between who is the police and who is the municipality. Even though the police wear a uniform and AMC officials wear civilian clothes with a photo ID, their movement in the group and joint purpose blurs the markers that might otherwise distinguish them from one another. Residents add that for every raid where someone is evicted, a seal is placed on the entrance of the property to prevent re-entry. Its desperate occupants return just a few days later to salvage their belongings, seek shelter, and ensure a continuous cycle of raids. A head clerk at the municipality explained, "Sometimes we go to sites to visit to see if these terms and conditions are being upheld, and if they're broken, we take back the property. But we actually haven't taken any property yet. And really we know that of course they won't go, but we have to do it. We have to serve notice on them." This performance of raiding and occupying property is a performance. And there are other tactics to exert an inclusive citizenship. Amidst this performance, there are tactics to assert an inclusive citizenship that foregrounds horizontal relations between citizens, so acts of solidarity. These are apparent in the strategies to resist the power exerted by the AMC, particularly around property management and payment. Such strategies focus on non-compliance and selective collaboration that contributes to making a space where residents are able to renegotiate the rules of their tenure and shape aspects of their own governance. For example, residents are required to forge a resident association, which takes responsibility for the collection and spend of maintenance charges that are levied on everyone, the maintenance and cleanliness of common plots and residential blocks, and it represents a focal point for the AMC to communicate with residents. But resistance to forging such a committee is widespread. One former community leader explained, "The municipality keep telling us to form an association, but I don't think it will happen. No one wants to work together here. Where we lived before in the slums, it was ours. We'd lived there a long time. We'd organised ourselves. We'd done deeds for others and established what worked. Other people trusted us. But here, everyone is different. And this discourse of difference comes through in regional difference, linguistic difference, and ethnic and religious difference." He says there are Marathis, Gujaratis, Rajasthanis, different states in India. Also, if we made an association, then we become responsible for the maintenance of this block. The municipality will tell us to look after it, to make sure the area is clean, to make sure the leaks are fixed and the water works. If we form an association, the municipality is going to pass everything to us to fix. So in this example, non-compliance creates some kind of governance gains. Specifically, public health concerns from the high build-up of refuse meant that the municipality took back the function of maintaining common plots, despite the terms and conditions placing responsibility on residents. Although non-compliance is a strategy, it has had to be rethought in the face of an incredibly aggressive municipality that is seeking repayment from residents. Another former community leader said, "Over the 5 years that we've been living here, the AMC paid us no attention, so we paid them no attention. But now, after 5 years, they've stirred us, and so we've started to make a committee. We've made a resident association. We gathered the names of around 4 people in each block, and we'll try and arrange a meeting with the AMC and see what they have to say about our grievances before we take it further. But we have to make a committee now at some point, I think. If we don't, then the AMC won't ever look in our direction again. And then who will challenge them when they try to do things to us? No one else will do it, so we have to form a committee." The realization that the need for collective action overrides this divisive discourse of too much difference among residents stems from increased pressure from the municipality on residents to make property payments. Initially, many residents said that they didn't need to pay. They didn't know that they had to pay, although one disclosed in a quiet moment, "Truly we know, we all know. We know we have to pay, they tell us all the time." With this increased pressure to pay, there appears to be a widespread recognition that any strategy of resistance needs more than claims of ignorance. It requires a collective response. The resident association, or at least the promise of one, residents hope, will play an important part in renegotiating payment plans with the municipality. And experienced political organisers with links to low-level BJP, the governing party officials, said, "Our hope is that we will get to speak to the commissioner and ask that he forgives some of the debt and leaves a manageable amount for us, but we haven't sat with him yet." So I ask, do you think you really will be able to sit with him? He will sit with us. He has to. He is trying to get money from us, not the other way around. We're already inside the property. We will say to him, "We are ready to make payments, but you have to sit with us and make some agreement, and then we'll give it to you." And I ask, do you think the AMC will really apply a seal, so close off the property? It depends. If they follow the legal process, then yes. But people living here are such that if a seal was applied, we would take to the streets. People do whatever it comes into their minds to do. Up until now, the AMC haven't been able to do anything to enforce payment. And if people get together and come to oppose the AMC, well, then they still can't do anything. The problem is that the AMC might call the police and then things will escalate. But we'll be prepared. Focusing on those two sets of perspectives, the state and marginalised people, reveals different sets of rationalities that may not square away with this idea of an inclusive citizenship. In this resettlement project, as with the in situ upgrade in South Africa, any political settlement where the state upholds housing rights to national or international legislation, alongside this progressive commitment to draw socially excluded citizens into legally protected tenure arrangements, appears compromised or even undermined by the experiences of residents trying to secure state-subsidised housing and then live in it, with large numbers simply unable to meet all of the terms and conditions of residence. Conferring property rights as part of an economic development strategy would suggest that residents have the means to take out loans against their property or to invest in asset building, that municipalities have access to a wider revenue base through property tax, or are able to economically exploit land and real estate realised by resettling people. In my South African study, no one had taken out a loan against their property. High rates of violence and the racial spatial division of the city still meant that the improved aesthetics did not translate into wealthier people, who were predominantly white, choosing to move themselves or their business into an area that is still predominantly black. In Ahmedabad, many residents had taken out loans against their occupancy and property, but the capital has gone towards everyday costs and property repayments, as opposed to building up investments or value in the assets, including the property. The idea of managing informality by expanding the rational order of the state brings manifestations of the state into close encounters with people, specifically local bureaucracy, in the form of either ward committees in their politics of process and preference, or the AMC in its circular performance of upholding and undermining its own rules. From the narratives of residents, it's clear that the state, through local bureaucracy, displays considerable authority over important parts of people's lives, such as where they live and how, not through high-level organising, but through very mundane application of rules and the circumvention of those rules. At the beginning, I said that my engagement with who owns the city and how is anchored in who is the city for and how is this policed, socially, culturally, legally, economically, and politically. Within a multi-scalar inclusive citizenship, a citizenship from below is enacted and compromised in the fog of local bureaucracy which stands in for the state. The actions of local bureaucrats can undermine those three rationales that I gave for why the state would want to award property rights as part of its own citizenship-making project. For people who are marginalised, and especially those at the margin of the margins, extra conditions are applied and can be applied at any moment through the housing process to minimize their experiences of citizenship. Now, I wanted to use this talk to lay some groundwork for a deeper discussion of the possibilities and challenges to multi-scalar inclusive citizenship. And I think I've covered a lot of the challenges, but I want to end on a note of possibility for us to think about together. And that is in the communal city of Ahmedabad. People came together in solidarity and to uphold their right to housing via forming a committee to overcome entrenched ethnic, linguistic, and religious difference only when they were faced by the existential threat from the state. So is an inclusive citizenship only possible as an act of resistance against the state? And I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kamna. That was very interesting. Maybe we should start the Q&A session with that last question that you asked. I think that's an excellent question. I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on that last question.
I like it. It's not me answering the first question. It's all of you. Just, Lena, somebody put their hand up at the back.
Yes, great.
Hello, thank you so much for your presentation. It was really interesting. I was thinking mostly of the city of Ahmedabad. Mm-hmm. So the thoughts I had while you were presenting is the fact that indeed in North India, in most of those big cities that had a lot of communal violence, the city itself is usually organized in quarters of community. So there will be a Muslim quarter, Hindu quarter, Sikh quarter, etc. And if I understood right, then in those relocation, everyone is mixed up, despite those differences. And what I was thinking with that is that I can see from the AMC also that being a deliberate choice of breaking those solidarities that already exist, and also putting those people, I know from what I've heard of experiences that living in community is a strategy of survival in a city where riots happen often. And I really feel that it can only be deliberate to take them away from those communities and survival strategies they've built and put them with a lot of people with whom they have tensions pre-existing, and already undermines kind of a way of solidarity building in that new community. Do you think that is a deliberate choice that is made by the states in Gujarat?
So in the, is it okay if I just answer straight away? Yeah? So in that resettlement site in particular, you saw the housing blocks. They go up to about 4 floors. It's a standard design. You'll see them all over India under the Jawaharlal Nehru Urban Renewal Mission program. In my site, informally, locally, people referred to divisions within the group. And the local names that were given to a particular set of blocks was Hindustan, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. And Hindustan was where Hindu families lived. Pakistan was where Muslim families lived, and Sri Lanka would be the mix. And it was predominantly people of scheduled tribe origins and a mix of scheduled caste people. And that nobody within the AMC would ever come on record and say that was a deliberate strategy at managing communal tensions to put people in different housing groups. Yet, it is impossible to see how else you could come up with such a neat division of people in residential spaces unless that was a consideration. And residents themselves believe it very strongly to have been a consideration. And with the case of Ahmedabad in particular, it was the communal violence when Narendra Modi was the chief minister there that resulted in that movement of people and the disruption, particularly in city centres. City centres were mixed historically, and the historic centre of Ahmedabad has always been mixed. And that violence literally shifted people up if they weren't killed and pushed them into the peripheries as safer spaces to be in. So this pattern of resettlement is, I would say, it's cementing, in many ways, divisions that have been ongoing for the past 10 to 15 years.
Other questions, or maybe, some reflections on the question of whether solidarity grows as an act of resistance against the state, or other questions or thoughts or comments.
Yeah, I might have a question on the notion of informality. Partially because I know very little about India, a bit more about South Africa, but still too little to ask detailed questions. My question is, I guess, how to critique let's say the disciplinary aspects of the governing of informality, so the state trying to sort of regulate, discipline informality, while at the same time not romanticizing informality. I think that's my very basic question.
So more recently, as I reflect on my own work, and this was done a little while ago, I query my own use of the term informality. And it's too simplistic. And this is like a flashback to the interview. That was one of the interview questions of earlier today. I prefer to think of multiple regimes of governance and what we call informality, and by we, I think particularly anyone with a Eurocentric lens and a Eurocentric positioning. It's one type of regime, and all of these regimes coexist and they're layered, and state governance regimes, the formal, is another one of those. And so the conditions that people live in, whether they're informal or formal, can be pretty awful. And it's that should really be the starting point for having a productive conversation about adequate housing and ownership, in the broader sense, a small O ownership. So I agree with what can become and what comes across as the romanticization of informality. It is not the romanticization of informality for me. It is recognizing how people use the regimes that they're a part of to resist something or to negotiate with someone to improve their lot in life.
Hello. Thanks for your talk. It's really interesting. I think both cases struck me as like governmental attempts and like short fixes somehow, or not very like long planned solutions. And I was thinking maybe like the first thing, are there any of these projects which can be which failed basically, where you could say, okay, those have been like, people have been living there for 20 years and actually it didn't work out right. And then also, are there any like innovative responses or attempts or learnings, like policy-wise? I'm thinking about like refining property right collection, property tax collection, or something, because you can also zone that or regulate that really like better instead of just draining people. Yeah, that's what I'm interested in.
I think there are lots of examples of failures of housing programs. The classic is, who's the housing people here? No one? Or you don't want me to call on you? There are lots of examples of housing failures, where the structure itself might crumble or it's not in poor conditions. In these cases, and if I'm talking particularly from a freehold title perspective for the moment, the failure relates to the theory of freehold titling. The idea that people need a freehold title in order to release the capital that might be locked within their land is a flawed economic rationale. And so what tends to happen is that people want to circumvent the costs associated with selling their property. So I would find a buyer. I want to sell my house to Lena. I'm not going to incur the extra cost of going to the municipal records office to change the record title and maybe pay them a fee in order to do so. I'm just going to hand you the papers, which means that that municipal record becomes out of date very quickly. And so you've got titles that don't match the official record belonging to that title. So that to me is a sense of failure, one of the senses of failure. The innovative attempts that can come about as a result of failure, I think those also exist in really good ways. So some of the huge emphasis that's been placed over the past 20 years on site and service schemes and informal settlement upgrading and resettlement programs has spurred a greater focus and concentration on rental housing as an understanding that not everyone is able to or wants to live in a city permanently or live in urban areas permanently. And so how and where does the state intervene in rental regimes, in securing people's tenure and fair access to rent? And that is also part of the innovation and the part of the learning that can produce successful housing strategies. Because the housing is never the house. It's the process of securing a place to live. Does that answer your question?
Hi, thanks for the talk. I have a question. I'm just wondering, it seems, both cases really seem to me like an own goal to the maybe good intentions. And it doesn't seem to be, well, I was just wondering at what point kind of does it really go wrong, and why is there no realization on higher levels that this is counterproductive, and kind of why is there no intervention? Is it that there's corruption or a lack of kind of evaluation or oversight?
Mm-hmm. Okay. I would question that it has gone wrong. Why do you think it's gone wrong?
Well, because you were talking about the reasons why you would, the 3 reasons why you would implement such projects, right? And I think they're obviously kind of, well, in economic development, they all seem to be very positive and positivistic. So, yeah, maybe I'm thinking too much in kind of the economic terms of like, but I just can't help but think, there must have been a lot of money also invested and spent. So sort of like, you must realize that there's a lot of wasted potential by draining people's funds and like accepting this these kind of horrible circumstances that people are ending up in.
So in the South Africa case, it's very successful. If you are, in the Cape City of Durban, if you are a Zulu person, it's pretty successful. In the case of Ahmedabad, the people that moved and have done well out of it, there are some, it's pretty successful. For the state, for the municipality that relocated people, the city centre, it might be worth just doing a little Google image search of Sabarmati River redevelopment programme. That city centre is beautiful. It's a stunning city centre. There are no slums on the sides of the riverbanks. It looks clean, it looks pretty, and it attracts wealthy middle-class families who go on Sunday strolls on the banks of the river. It's successful. The querying that I'm suggesting is, from where do we evaluate success, and from whose perspective are we making that assessment? And the people that I focused on, and I didn't choose to focus on these people. This was through my methodology, through the ways that I approach the research, where I'm trying to understand who is benefiting, who is not benefiting, what are the layers of citizenship. It allows me to find folks and focus my stories on the people who are at the margins of the margins. So the foreigner has no eligibility. He's a foreigner, whatever. why should he count in our measures of success? And I'm saying he should count. So others would disagree and say that these are very successful schemes. I'm querying that basis of success. And that's down to all of us, right? Are you a student? Or you're a staff? You're a student. Okay. So presume that you might be working, or you will intend to work, something in the urban field. So when we use terms like the urban poor, who is in that? And who is not included in that? Within our own imaginations, within our perspectives of planning, within the policy approaches that we take. And if we're going to go out on a limb and say, actually, what I want to focus on are the marginalized within the marginalized, that's a pretty radical position, potentially. And it has no guarantee that the majority of the urban poor within that grouping of the urban poor benefit. So it's down to your personal politics, I suppose, as to where do you want to stand and whose perspective do you want to plan from.
Thank you for your detailed answer.
Further thoughts, questions? Yeah.
Thank you. Now, during your detailed answer now, I was thinking that we're mostly talking about citizenship as a category now. But in your answer, I was thinking whether, at least in the case of India, whether the category of class is maybe at least equally important in this regard, because as I understood, most of those people had or held Indian citizenship. But correct me if I'm wrong here.
Yeah, they did. So the distinctions between folks there would be linguistic-based difference, state-based difference, caste for certain, and religion. So Muslims wouldn't say that they're within the caste hierarchy, but that's still playing out. Scheduled tribe people wouldn't say that they're within the caste hierarchy. Scheduled tribe is a state-designated category. Was it just a clarification question, or is there something else? Okay.
Yeah, no, I meant class, not caste.
Class.
Yes, because you were talking that these people were displaced from the city center, and now it's a place for the middle class. So I think this category of class maybe is a broader category that applies to all of those that were displaced, despite of their caste, despite of their linguistic background, and so on and so forth.
Yes, they're all low-income people. Yes. And the middle classes, they stroll next to the river. No one's living next to the river. They've been cleared, and the banks have been expanded into these walkways. And right along the bank is there's an ashram where Mahatma Gandhi was for many years, and it's now there are proposals to turn it a little bit like Disneyland. So there's like there's proposals for a hologram Gandhi to meet you when you walk in, and it's all part of the development of the area. It's all part of making a world-class city. So again, it's another discourse that I'm sure you've been exposed to in your studies, the making of world-class cities. This is part of Ahmedabad's attempt to make a world-class city. So they recently built a metro system. It's not that big a city. You can get around quite easily, but there's a metro system because that's what world-class cities have. And what world-class cities don't have is a bunch of visibly poor people in dilapidated housing next to your city centre.
Thank you very much for this very precise talk. I don't really have a question, but maybe rather a reflection, maybe something that I took from the talk that I would like to bounce back to you to see if it makes sense. But I think in general, when we talk about housing, there's a big insistence on affordability. But it seems to me that also through your talk, you show us the importance of accessibility as well, which is slightly a different thing, as you see how access is so much biased through race, ethnicity, and such. And would you agree with that shift as being an important one?
Yes. I'm glad you took that from the talk. Yeah. Absolutely. This discourse of affordability it's a very particular prism. And it's the same sort of prism that leads to this dystopian thinking of what is the value of property. The value of property is released through its financial value, its monetary value. And affordability, yes, is important, but accessibility has so much more to it. Our cities should be accessible.
It's me again. I had another question pop in my mind listening to everyone else. I was wondering, when you go to the global south as a European, even as a European from the diaspora, you find yourself in a particular position where you're mostly speaking a language from the north. You also come from a certain caste and class. And I was wondering for you, how did that affect the way you would connect with those people who are more from rural classes and lower classes too, and from the global south, and how did that disparity of privilege affect your way of leading that research and being true to what they want to communicate to you?
It's a wonderful question. So there are lots of dimensions to it. The first, I suppose, is in my name. My name is visibly Indian for anyone that knows the subcontinent. And coded within my name is a caste relationship, which meant that I was read in very particular ways. And when I was doing this research, I was also, I'm an academic at UCL. So again, I was read in particular ways. I was also unmarried at the time, scandal. And that was read in particular ways. There were moments when I was minimized and there were moments when I was elevated, depending on who I was interviewing. So I had one encounter in the municipality where I thought we had an interview, and I turned up and the Mazid, looked at me and sort of shooed me away a bit and said, "No, you need a letter of introduction." So I went around the corner and typed my own letter of introduction and said, "Oh, this is me." And then I came back and he went, "Okay, now you may sit." And then we had our interview. So there was a privilege that came with me carrying around UCL letterheaded notepaper and being able to sign my own letters that then was not replicated, of course, in other environments. And it's actually something that I've written about. I've got a paper in Gender, Place and Culture on my name and how my name affected my positionality and the ways in which people spoke to me and they didn't speak to me. So there was another occasion where I interviewed the mayor, and the mayor asked what kind of a Patel I am. And I didn't know, because I grew up in London where my engagements with caste are subsidiary to my engagements with race. And so in that context, she presumed and expanded her idea of what I don't know to meaning that I don't know anything about housing. I don't know anything about India. I don't know anything about Ahmedabad. And that then affected the content and the substance of our interview. It affected how I reflected back on the data. And I presumed, because I was hurt by the encounter, that she didn't have anything useful to say. And then that came through in the data that I picked up and that I wrote about. But the ways in which I'm answering your question now, and how I wrote about it in that paper, and how I reflected on it in my data, is something that I notice not everyone does, particularly everyone who comes from the global north and goes into a global south encounter. Those relationships are presumed, superiority is presumed, and I was forced to disentangle it because of my racial identity, because of the coding of the caste name identity within my name, and the coding of my gender. And the ways in which I was read made sticky moments that forced a level of reflection that is not shared by others. And it's certainly not shared by researchers I know who work in India from the UK.
Other questions? I think, is that a hand? No. I think I'll ask a question. When I said this thing about formulating questions, that was because I never formulate my question in my head before I ask, so bear with me. I was just wondering, maybe you could say something about your engagement with the development industry or the development sector. if any, like, because I was very interested in what you said about like freehold title being a flawed concept, and the Mystery of Capital book, like, I mean, like, it's been around for quite 2 decades now, but still, I went to a World Bank conference on land and poverty, I think it was called, even the name, and everything was freehold title. It's so I was wondering, like, do you engage, like, for example, these kind of insights and so on? Do they reach, maybe through DPU, which is a very well-respected institution and so on in the development sector as well? Do they actually reach the development industry? And do people indeed, like, start thinking critically about, for example, freehold title, and that being the concept to get people out of poverty, which is what they still claim in so many places.
So to answer that, I'm going to have to zoom out somewhat and think about how does the development sector work? What are the mechanisms through which the sector works? And thinking of it as an industry, I find particularly helpful. It's an industry that has layers of governance to it. It is an industry with a neoliberal logic that determines what is funded, how is funded, by whom, and to whom do contracts go. And so in that industry of global north, global south, what is the role of consultancy firms, for example, in the tendering process for World Bank grants? And so where the World grants and loans, where the World Bank is still very much fixated on the economics of freehold titling, how do they manipulate, and I don't mean that in a negative way necessarily, how do they use the system of the development industry to ensure that that filters through? And there are multiple ways in which an organisation like the World Bank does that, through conditional loans, through grants to consultants that have to tender for programs that are stated explicitly, you must regularise and freehold title this country or this region. So that's the power of it. And gosh, there are hundreds of academics who have written critically about freehold titling. And should the World Bank listen? Yes. Do they listen? I can't see evidence of it. Clearly you don't see evidence of it. Are we perhaps targeting the wrong places? Maybe. But, there are so many layers of politics that are going on in that. When democratic governments work in 4 or 5 year cycles, do they want to be the government that secured that massive World Bank loan, or do they want to be the government that passed it up? Very few fall into that latter category. It's a huge question.
Further questions?
No one answered my question. Huh?
Yes, I was just going to say. Anybody, any thoughts about that? Like, maybe some of the people who are working in maybe like solidarity, resistance against the state in Belgium. I'm looking at some particular people.
Yeah, I was thinking about this question the whole time because I was thinking about my own experience with urban activism. So I live usually in Berlin, and we recently had a very successful referendum that we organized against the big landlord companies. So there, a lot of solidarity emerged, but through resistance against multinational companies. And we actually turned to the state for help against those companies. So I was wondering how this fits with this question, whether solidarity emerges through opposition against the state. Maybe you can elaborate a bit more what kinds of solidarity emerge between these, or in these moments that you looked at. Or your thoughts on comparing these various forms of resistance that you can have.
I'm not sure that I can answer that. It was a reflection that in these cases, in these contexts, what brought people together within state-subsidized housing, where the state is a primary actor rather than the private sector developing housing for poor people, entry-level housing, the state becomes a pivotal actor to bring people together as resistance. So I'm curious, very curious about your example and how and what political basis that solidarity was forged between the state, or the version of the state, the municipality, and the activists. I mean, could you say a little bit more, perhaps, about those politics?
I mean, in this case, the state was not really perceived as the opponent, because it was through the legal measures that we, of course, because we hold German citizenship, I think it's also an important category in the whole story. Mm-hmm. But it offered us an opportunity to show some resistance against this buying off of the city from these multinational companies. Yeah, that's why I was thinking about it, because there the state was perceived more as a solution mm-hmm. to a struggle than the opponent in the struggle.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I would guess that in the case of South Africa, the state is largely seen as a protector, especially the post-apartheid state. And there's been a conscious effort to do that, which is where that political settlement idea comes in, correcting the historic wrong. But it's in its everyday machinations within the municipal level and how people encounter the state that those sharp edges are revealed. But I'll read more about Berlin and see if I can understand that transfer a bit better.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Kamna, maybe you have another question for the another triggering. Oh, I have another question here.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. I was just curious because we're talking about this movements to resist, and I would like to know if there are some movements to resist before they move it to the different settlements. When they were in the city center, if there was some resistance or some associations between them to resist.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes.
And they were effective at some point, or there was police.
Ultimately, no, because people were moved, but groups were able to delay movement, and there are lots of things that come together that need to come together in order to physically relocate a large number of people, and that includes shifts in the political parties in rule. It would include who is the mayor at that time, who's in national government at the time, in a federal system. All of these things have to coalesce to make it possible to wholesale pick people up and move them. And individual resistance movements, or very small-scale local resistance movements, maybe they're quite limited in what they can do in that regard.
Yeah, I was thinking of it because I did a research in Brazil of how the importance of the scholars in a way of resistance for those who are threatened by these political powers to reassessment, and so I was just curious if there was some, even from academia, like local academia, if there are some movements that could actually help them to prevent this change of places and this change of resettlement.
Yeah, people protest, but on paper it looks nice. Yeah. Not just the relocation, but the fact of moving from a house that's subject to flooding to a permanent structure with resources. It all sounds lovely, aside from the movement and the travel. And this is often the subject of what people have been campaigning for. We want a house with dignity. We want to live with dignity in a structure that is safe. And this is what has been offered. It just comes with lots of strings attached.
Thank you.
I was thinking of the question of solidarity. It's me again.
Hello.
Do not change. I was thinking of the question of solidarity in the Belgian context, more specifically in the Brussels context, and of citizenship. And I just had a reflection coming to my mind that I feel that in Brussels, the people who have the most radical approach to retaking back the housing market are actually people who are undocumented. and who have to find different ways to live in the city. And they also have a logic of non-compliance because they are asked to leave but decide to stay and decide to use empty houses and occupy them and to create a new housing market next to the formal one. So I do feel that the idea of the citizenship that you presented also kind of carries on even here, because it is those people who are, and again, it's not like something that has to be glamorized because it is a problem and they do it out of necessity, but it does create, I feel, the most radical approach to the city that can exist, at least in Brussels. That was just the thought I had compared to that. Even though also those people come from very different places and very different parts of life and have a lot of differences in between them, but they have to come together faced with state violence also in this case.
Yeah, it's fantastic insight. Thank you for sharing it.
Maybe just to continue on that thought, I find, Bas is going to laugh, I find the work of Fred Moten and Stefano Harney in the Undercommons really relevant in relation to that, where they talk about all of these uses and subjectivities and actually forms of intelligence and self-organization that are out there, but by people who are excluded by systems. And for them, it's really important to assert, and that goes a bit back to what you said earlier about the violence of semantics and naming something formal, informal. For them, it's these practices, they are intelligence. This is spatial intelligence, and it's important to make it legible. They don't need to be saved. They don't need to be brought into these systems that then, make them partake to their own exclusion. We can look at those kinds of intelligences as potential alternative systems. And to be able to take that seriously, to look at it, to work with it, to find funding that goes to that instead of to the other thing where then they have to fit into, which they never will, is I think a really, really important one. And then maybe to add one personal thought, I think you also mentioned the importance not to consider state as a monolith. I think state is also a collection of individuals. So for a lot of things that in my activist work that moves, it's about building alliances with certain individuals within those structures that can give legibility to what happens outside the structures as well. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Any final question or remark, thoughts?
Does this fit with your studies? Does this make sense to you in the context of the theories you're learning? You don't have to say yes because your teachers are here. You can tell me later if this doesn't fit with anything that you've been studying, but I hope if you're encountering things like world-class cities and tenure security and ideas of citizenship, because cities are for people, then some of this might resonate. And it might not resonate right now, but maybe when you reflect back on it later, you'll see some of the connections.
I think so too, definitely. I think we will wrap up here. So thank you very much for your talk. It was really insightful. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, everyone, for being here. So thank you. See you next time.